Good evening. Evening. Oh, you're awake. That's good. In case any of you doze off, I've got a cure for that right here. So anybody dozes off on me, you'll get a rude awakening. But I'm here to talk about our beloved East Hill Cemetery, and I know a lot of you probably know a lot of what I'm going to be talking about, but nevertheless, bear with me because maybe some of the folks here haven't heard some of the stuff that I'm going to be talking about. Our cemetery basically is divided by the state line, almost like Bristol. It's cut catty-cornered, half in Tennessee, half in Virginia. And most all the ground that we now know as East Hill Cemetery was originally owned by old Colonel Goodson, who owned most of the property on Bristol, Virginia, back in the day. But I will say this, that neither city owns East Hill Cemetery. Matter of fact, nobody owns East Hill Cemetery. It is governed by the board of directors, which I am a member, and we have several members of our board here. Thank you guys for coming. And we have asked from time to time for help or support from the cities, and it seems like it always falls on deaf ears. And you know, Bud Phillips used to always refer to our cemetery as 37 acres of history, and that's exactly what it is. I like to think of it or tell a lot of people that as far as I'm concerned, it's Bristol's history, period. The most unknown part of our history is laying right up around East State Street. We have about 4,000 graves in our 37 acres, and that's the ones we know. Unfortunately, there is some there that we don't know and probably will never know. We are listed on the National Register of Historical Places. It took several years and some pretty good work to get that accomplished, but we are listed that way. We're also a member of the Civil War Historical Trails, due mostly to the fact that we have so many Civil War soldiers buried up there. And I guess to sort of qualify myself in a sense, I've been in and around that cemetery ever since I was a teenager. Basically because my mother and a group of ladies used to take care of the Confederate graves up there, and I got volunteered to do it. But as time went on, I even got to where occasionally I'd go up and help Julian Burroughs. If you know who Julian Burroughs was, he was a fellow who took care of the cemetery by himself for many years and done the best he could. And he didn't even have a riding lawnmower, folks. He took care of it with push mowers. But he done the best he could, and he kept it in pretty good shape. But now, we have a professional group that mows it once a week for us, and they're doing a bang-up job. The only bad part of that is it costs $1,500 a week to get that place mowed. And some people have said, well, that sounds outrageous. Well, we've had several others come up there and look it over and make us a bid, and a lot of them just laughed and left. So I think we've got a pretty good bargain. But that brings me to, you know, I've watched TV a little bit off and on, and I've learned on TV they give you about 3 minutes of what you want to hear, and then they give you a commercial, so I'm going to do a commercial. Any of you that can, anytime you can, any way you can, we can use financial help. What little money we have is tied up in the stock market, which in the past has kind of kept us on an even plane. But if you know anything about the stock market the last couple of years, it's really kicked us bad. And I will say that if you're interested, we are a 501c3. Any donation is tax deductible. And I left over here on this table some little papers that with our secretary's name and address on it. If you can and would like to, you can send a donation to her, and we would really appreciate it because we need it, believe me. Like I said, we are split half and half, Virginia and Tennessee. Now the first grave that was made up at East Hill, of course then it wasn't called East Hill, was little Nellie Gaines, 5-year-old daughter of a tenant farmer that worked for Colonel Goodson. And the little girl, Gaines had made up their mind to move to Texas to hopefully gain land of their own and become independent, not be a tenant for somebody. But the little girl took sick and passed away. Well, the Gaineses was already loaded up to leave, and I think was going with a wagon train to Texas. But they did not want Nellie buried on the plantation of Goodson's for the reason that they felt like that grave would soon be lost. It would be trotted over, cattle grazed over it, or maybe even planted over. And old Colonel Goodson, even though sometimes he could be cantankerous, had a very benevolent spot in his heart. And he told them, well, take little Nellie up there to what they called Round Hill at the time, and bury her up there because we're not going to be doing no farming up there. And the word is that he had really basically thought maybe about turning that into a cemetery anyway. And you know, in that period of time, most folks looked for a high hill for their burial. And the fellow took little Nellie up there and buried her. Well, he wanted to mark the grave somehow or the other, and he had stick with him that he'd been kind of plodding his horses along with, and it happened to, he stuck it in the ground right at the grave, and it was a poplar branch. Well, this was in February, and when he returned later on in the year, lo and behold, that branch had took root and was growing. And actually, for her grave, for a long time, there was a fine big poplar tree grew there, which pretty well marked her grave. But in 1977, a storm came through and blew that tree down. But in the meantime, her father had returned, I think it was in '88, from Texas, and went up to visit her grave, and he had been doing very well in Texas. He hired a carpenter to build a little house over top of Nellie's grave. And it lasted for several years. Of course, you know what happens to something that's just made out of lumber. It eventually went the way of anything along that line. Well, they say that several other young people in Bristol had passed away, and that the old colonel had agreed to let them be buried up there also, but if so, their graves were never marked and has been lost to posterity. But then along came the war between the states, and the Confederate government leased the Nichols House Hotel, which was right there, right at the railroad tracks, for a hospital. It was one of 3 different hospitals. It was the biggest one in Bristol. They brought wounded and sick soldiers in on the railroad, and they had a ramp there. They could take them right into the hospital. But unfortunately, like always in case of war, some of these fellows died. Some from disease, some from their wounds, whatever. And again, the old colonel graciously said, well, take them up there to the Round Hill, and inter them. Unfortunately, about all these fellows were buried with no ceremony whatsoever. They were just taken up there, and in a lot of cases, maybe in a blanket only, and put in the ground. We call this now our Confederate Field of Honor, and for a long time, these graves were not marked. I think it was about 1920, assume it was the UDC and some other groups got together and put up these stones, and they are more representation than they are exactly graves. They estimate that there were somewhere over 100 Confederate soldiers buried up there.
Do they have names of some of them?
No, almost all these were unknown.
Unknown.
They was a record kept, and the word has it that when Stoneman made his raid through Bristol and burned a lot of the stuff in Bristol, some of the warehouses, that either the book got hid or burnt, destroyed. So actually, very few of them are actually known. In the meantime, right after the war, a fellow by the name of Lafayette Johnson, who's buried up there near the crest of the hill, he got to worried about these graves being lost. And thinking of little Nellie's grave and the soldiers' graves, he went to the colonel and propositioned him to buy 2 acres of ground, which would include the Confederate graves and little Nellie's grave, and probably a few other citizens that had been buried up there by that time. Well, even though the old colonel had sort of, as at least they say, planned to make a cemetery out of that, he wasn't above making a profit. He sold those 2 acres of land to Lafayette for $100. That's $50 an acre, which was a pretty handsome price for property at that time, especially unfarmable property. But Lafayette, as soon as he got the deed, he turned it over to the Women's Memorial Society here in Bristol to take care on the proposition that they would take care of the soldiers' graves and the ones that was up there. Not long after that, it began to fill up. A lot of entrepreneurs, if you want to use that word, or people looking to make a little bit of a profit, began to buy sections of that property off of the colonel and then sold plots, anywhere from 8 grave plot to a 16 grave plot for a family. And that made for a bad situation because they had records. The records never got passed around. We have very little record other than a book that Gary Rose and his wife spent many days up there in the cemetery composing. And of course, all they could go by was stones that they could find. And that is basically the only record we have of burials in East Hill. But now if you go up to the Field of Honor, as we call it, you'll see this obelisk there. That obelisk is to James Keeling. He was a private soldier, and it's who our group is named after. His job, he was a part of a group of Confederate soldiers that was known as Thomas's Legion. They were mostly Cherokee Indians and a group of kind of wild mountain men from all over and around where Pigeon Forge and Gatlinburg and that area is now. Well, Keeling's job was to guard the bridge at Strawberry Plains down just north of Knoxville there. It was a 400-foot long wooden structured bridge. And on November the 8th, 1861, a group of Unionists decided that they was going to burn all the bridges from starting down at Watauga, Bluff City, all the way into Knoxville, just to hinder the Confederate government from being able to trade soldiers and supplies back and forth. When they came to the bridge, Keelan defended it. He was the only man there. He couldn't find his rifle. He was down in a little area underneath the bridge. He did have a single-shot pistol, and they estimate there were about 30 of them that attacked the bridge to burn it. He managed to shoot one of them mortally. He wounded several others, killing 3 or 4 of them, and ended up being hacked all to pieces himself. But they soon realized they had a wild man on their hand, wasn't going to give up the bridge, so they left it. And so he was called the defender of the bridge. And I might add that he received one of the few Confederate medals of honor for what he done down there. A few years back, our SCV camp erected a monument there to not only those soldiers buried there that you've seen in the field of honor, but to every Confederate soldier we could find in the grave in the cemetery. A fellow by the name of Jim Maddox spent, I wouldn't even dare guess how much time he spent searching graves, going to East Tennessee State, University of Tennessee, anywhere he could find information. And he was able to come up with about 230 Confederate soldiers that's buried throughout our cemetery up there. And that's kind of our main concern, and the thing that got me into being a part with East Hill. But I asked any of you got a few minutes sometime, go up there and look at our monument. We've got 4 of those plaques on it, and we're continuously on the backside adding a new one. We find one occasionally through some relative one way or another. But while we're up there, we'll look at this grave. This is old General Shelby, Evan Shelby. There's a good story about Evan Shelby. You see, he owned Shelby's Fort back before almost anything was here. And his fort stood where the Weaver's funeral home is now. And he'd done a lot of trading and so forth. And he was called a general because at one time he was in charge of I think it was Fort Loudon down toward Knoxville. But his son was also in the militia and named Isaac Shelby. And Isaac was one of the fellows that led the group from around this area on the Over the Mountain March to the Battle of Kings Mountain. And sometime I'd like to come back and tell you that story. But to talk about the old general, when he passed away, they buried him down off Shelby Street. That's the reason it's named Shelby now. But as the town started to grow, the town wanted that cemetery lot, so they dug poor general up, moved him up to about where the Tower Apartments is now, to what was called, I think, Oak Grove Cemetery. Him and a few other people that was buried there. Well, it wasn't long before the city wanted that property, so they dug the poor general up again. And they put his his remains in a box. They didn't know what to do with them. They wanted to protect him, so they put him into jail. Which that proves, folks, you can get in the slammer even when you're gone. But the family agreed to bring him up here to what was probably called the city cemetery at that time, and bury him down near where our main gate is, at the picture you've seen at the start. But the family wasn't happy with that. They said the old general used to come up there on top of Round Hill and spend a lot of time sitting up under those oak trees and just gazing out over said it reminded him of where he was born in Maryland. So it also got the name of Maryland Hills by some folks. But finally, he got to his final resting place, and if you notice, I don't know whether I get this pointer to work or not, but the big iron slab that lays over his grave was produced down at the King's Foundry. And if you go down to Ordway Cemetery, you'll see several of those type big iron grave markers. Now let's move on. Now I'm only going to be able to hit some high spots on the cemetery with the time we have. But I'd like to look at some of the monuments, and this one is one that I've always liked to talk about. And I honestly believe up there at East Hill, we have the most diverse set of different kinds of, all kinds of markers that you'll find anywhere in this whole region. This one was the old Judge Haynes, Hal Haynes. The one thing that's really unique about Brother Haynes is, and he was a judge, he got moved up, he was a lawyer, got to be a judge in this area. That monument is not stone, it's metal, it's a zinc oxide. And these type, and we have 3 of them up there, we'll see one more of them if I have time. They were ordered, could be ordered from Sears and Roebuck out of Baltimore. And they came in a crate, and all that had to be assembled once it got to the cemetery, which makes it, and they have lasted really well. I'm surprised at them. Okay, if you go to our cemetery, this is one monument you'll catch your eye, even maybe driving by. This was old Will Smith's monument, and all the property around there was his that he had bought. Now, Will Smith was a brick mason and had built some of the finest buildings in Bristol. But in his old age, he decided he wanted a real special monument. And he was to the age he could almost not do his brickwork anymore, but the story goes he came to the cemetery every day in a straight back chair and gave directions and watched it be built. And people asked him, well, why did you want to build such a big monument? Well, he said, I live over on Orchard Hill, on Hill Street over there. I want to be able to sit on my front porch and see where I'm going. And they said that you could actually sit on his front porch and see that monument. It's quite a monstrosity. Here's another one of our monuments, and it too is one of the metal monuments. And this is W.W. James. Now, he was a very prominent businessman here in Bristol for many years. And one thing that he was given a lot of credit for is that he was real instrumental in helping to get Sullins College off the ground and going. Matter of fact, he was so instrumental in it that at one time they thought about even naming the college James College, but because the first president was Sullins and he didn't really want that, I don't think he didn't want that glory added to him, so they named it Sullins College. Here's another one of our monuments, and as you can notice, the weather hasn't been good to this one. This was Brother Naves, Joseph Naves, and he erected that monument, bought it, and had it brought in here in honor of his wife. And it's time for a commercial again. Anytime any of you have time and would like to do it, as you can see looking at our various monuments, feel free to come up there and clean any monument, any stone that you would like. My one request is if you come to clean a stone, please use only a product called D2. I know Jackie has used a lot of it in the past, and it does a wonderful job, and it's environmental safe and it's stone safe. For Pete's sake, please don't use any bleach. That destroys a stone in time. And you can get that over at a place called Harris Concrete Supplies that is on this end of Island Road. And one good thing about the D2, you don't have to scrub it, it helps, but you can just spray it on there and walk off and leave it, and Mother Nature will do its job on it, Jackie. All right, this monument here was to Cyrus King. He was the fourth child of the old Reverend King, who owned most of everything on the Tennessee side of Bristol, from the state line all the way down the Beaver Creek to way in below where Friendship Ford used to be. Said he owned several thousand acres. Cyrus didn't particularly like the idea of working on the farm, but he was very well educated, so he started teaching in Bristol, and unfortunately Cyrus didn't live very long. It said that he had taught for a few years, was out in his front yard playing with his children, and suddenly had a heart attack and passed away. And he was not buried at East Hill to start with. He, like the poor general, he was buried in the the Oak Hill Cemetery, and then later moved up here. But that's one of our many monuments. Now this one I like to talk about. This is what we put up with a lot at East Hill. This is the Nichols Monument up near the top of the hill. And as you can see, it's been broke. Why people do this, I'll never understand, but some vandals broke off a city speed sign and brought it up there and beat and banged on this thing till they broke it, which time for another commercial. Anybody knows somebody that's got a crane that would be willing to help us put that back together? We'd sure like to have the help. That top piece probably weighs, they would have to be able to lift about 500 pounds. You can notice also on the monument there were several bronze plaques to the family listing the Nicholses. They have been ripped off and taken for scrap. All right here's one. Of course, you can tell it could use a little cleaning too. This is the old Reverend King himself, who owned all the Tennessee property pretty much. Now he's down in the lower section of the cemetery because he, like the old general, originally wasn't here, but they unearthed him and brought him up to East Hill. And he's up there with two of his sons, and hopefully I'll get to the other in here in a minute. But old Reverend King, they said, owned probably 2,000 acres on the Tennessee side of town. And he owned all the property where we now call Bristol. Of course, right here is the fellow that we've talked about a little bit already, old Colonel Goodson, who owned everything on the Virginia side of Bristol. And he didn't call it Bristol. Matter of fact, he didn't like that name. He preferred to call it Goodson or Goodsonville. And he could be a little cantankerous at times, but he wanted Bristol, Virginia, he wanted Goodsonville to be what Bristol ended up being. And it's kind of ironic that all the persuading they ever tried to do to get him to name his part of the town Bristol fell on deaf ears till he passed away, and then a week after he passed away, they passed an ordinance to call it Bristol, Virginia. Here's a monument that I guess I really need to talk a whole lot about the fellow that's buried again there, but Joseph Anderson, who was the founder of Bristol. Now Joseph was pretty clever in a way. He was a merchant in Blumpville and then moved to Bristol, but he married Reverend King, who owned all that property's daughter. He got wind or knew that the railroad was coming through Bristol, and he was smart enough to know that where the railroad was, industry and business would come. So he wanted to build Bristol. And ironically enough, his wife Melinda wanted it named Paradise. And that's almost what Bristol was named. It was a real debate for a long time, but he settled on the name Bristol because he admired Bristol, England, which was a vastly business place, industrial town. But the story goes that he asked the old colonel to sell him 100 acres of his prime pasture land that joined the railroad, where the railroad would be. Well, old Reverend wasn't about to give up his favorite pasture land, so Melinda had to go to him and beg and talk, and finally she persuaded him to sell it to Joseph. And as soon as he got the deed, he went to Abingdon and got it all squared away and laid out the city of Bristol, and of course we know where it went from there. Hey, this unusual monument, and boy could it use some cleaning too, is to Dr. Zimmerman. He was the very first doctor in Bristol. Him and Joseph Anderson was pretty much good friends, and he was a doctor in Abingdon. And of course, Abingdon at the time, being county seat, was a booming little area and kind of overrun with doctors anyway, so it didn't take Joseph very much talking to talk Dr. Zimmerman to come into Bristol and be the doctor, saying, look, you'll be the only one there. And unfortunately, Dr. Zimmerman only practiced a short time till he passed away at a very, very young age. Dr. Keyes was the other doctor. But now Dr. Keyes was kind of strange in a way. He was an MD, but he preferred to pull teeth. He practiced more dentistry than he did doctoring. And Carter was a later doctor that came on after these two, and they erected that monument to all three of our earliest doctors in Bristol. And here's my favorite. Boy, I can talk about this all day long. This is to Jesse Pepper and family. And if you go around his monument there, you'll see Pepper, 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 Pepper. Somebody made the statement when they first came to Bristol, they were from Rural Retreat, that and Peppers was peppering all of Bristol. And there's even more of them buried up toward the top of the hill. One of the Peppers that came when Jesse was the oldest one, and they were all pharmacists, every one of them, and was known as doctors, which in the day and time, a pharmacist done probably as much medical doctoring as far as medicine and stuff went as the medical doctors. But he brought with him a doctor by the name of pharmacist by the name of Charles Pepper. Well, now Charles had a thing. He thought everybody needed to drink mineral water. He said it was good for your belly. But I don't know, has any of y'all ever drunk any mineral water or sulfur water? It's awful. He couldn't get people to drink it. So he started mixing first one kind of flavor with another. Finally, he come up with something that people didn't care to drink. It tasted pretty good, and he called it Pepper's Elixir. But he was having to have his mineral water brought in all the way from Rural Retreat by wagon, which was kind of rough going, expensive. So Charles left all his Pepper clan here, and he moved back to Rural Retreat and opened a pharmacy up there and continued to sell Pepper's Elixir. But he had a young assistant that learned the formula and knew how he was making the elixir. who left Charles there in rural retreat and moved to Texas. And he started producing it, and he named it Dr. Pepper. So if you drink Dr. Pepper, it started here in Bristol, really. Although Texas gets credit for it because they commercialized it. Oh, here's another favorite of mine, is old Reverend James Doak Tadlock. Now, he was proud of his middle name Doak because he was named for the old Presbyterian circuit preacher Samuel Doak, who was instrumental in starting lots of the Presbyterian churches in this area. He went to school down at Washington's College, went on, got his degrees, got his ministerial degrees, came back and actually taught down at Washington's College for a while. And then he came to Bristol and preached at the First Presbyterian Church and several other Presbyterian churches. And when the Presbytery decided to start a college here, he was the natural choice. He was the first president of King College. Of course, everybody knows, most of you know this monument, my beloved Bud Phillips. I just wish one thing. I've got one regret about Bud. I wish I could remember everything he told me. That man could tell you every grave up there, who they were, who their family was, where they worked, how many kids they had. It didn't matter. And spending a lot of time up there, I got to know Bud, and he would be up there researching graves and stuff, and we would pass a lot of time, even spent some time over at his place. What a great man. What a great loss it was when he left us. Now here's another old Colonel Fulkerson, and I hope I've got time to elaborate a little bit on him. And he was a lawyer here in Bristol, and a very good one. But when the Civil War broke out, he offered his services to the Confederacy, became a major in the 19th Tennessee, which was formed up at Blumpville, served with them quite a bit, and then they said, well, they propositioned him, since he was a very persuasive person, to come back to Bristol and organize another group, which became the 63rd Tennessee, and he was the colonel of it. One claim to fame for Fulkerson was he was one of what is titled the Immortal 600. And I could spend all night talking about that. Maybe sometime I'll come back and talk about it. This was 600 officers that was in a Union prison, and they pulled them out of that prison and used them for human shields in South Carolina. We were fortunate at East Hill to have 3 of these. Robert Bryant was one of them, and William Allen was the other. And we had several of two of the Woods brothers, which I probably won't have time to talk about, that was at the same prison camp, but they luckily their names were not pulled to take part in that. You want to do some real reading sometime, research this. What they went through is unbelievable. Okay, this monument is another one of our unique ones. This is to Billy Wood. Now, Billy Wood was a young man during the Civil War, and he was at VMI. I think he was about 15 years old when the cadets there at VMI was pulled out and asked to fall in and fought in the Battle of Newmarket. And I think, if my memory serves me right, there was 11 of them were killed in that battle. These were all young 13, 14, 15-year-old boys, but they fell in and done just a marvelous job. Matter of fact, they were capable and able to capture one of the Union artillery pieces, which helped turn the tide of the battle. Okay, this monument, there was three of the Wood brothers that lived here in Bristol. This was Major Clinton Wood. He was pretty much into everything around here. One of his main things was trying to develop the coal fields and the railroad going into the Southwest Virginia to retrieve the coal. And of course his name was Henry Clinton Woods, and Clintwood, Virginia is named for him. And he stayed in around Bristol most of the time. One thing that he did accomplish, he was able to get prisoner help. He became a legislator, and he was able to get prisoner help to help build some of the railroad out of Bristol into the coal fields of Virginia. Another one of the Woods brothers was Captain Woods. He was a prisoner of war, and while he was in one of the prison camps, met up with some fellows and started studying law. When the war was over, he continued his study, became a lawyer, and they said he was a doggone good one. And he must have been, because he left Bristol and went to Washington, D.C., and actually was a legal consultant to some of the people in our government up there. Later, he even went on to New York City, and that was there when he passed away, but they brought his body back to here. Now this is my favorite one to talk about, and I'm sorry that there's some ghosts on these pictures, but this is old John Emmert. Now he was a Confederate soldier also, served in the Civil War, survived it and came home back to Bristol, and served as a sheriff in Bristol for several years. And then he got a job, and this is the part I like to talk about because you may not sleep well tonight. He got a job with the Smithsonian Institute, and his job was to go down all through the region here and visit Indian burial mounds, unearth them, and he done his work very nice, neat, clean. He would actually go to a grave and make a sketch of it, record what he found, and then put it back. But he was down near, somewhere down between Greenville and Morristown. At Bat Creek, somebody had told him about a certain Indian mound that was different than any they had ever seen before. So he went and worked on it, and he was astonished at what he found. There were 7 bodies laying in a row, and at the head of them was an 8th body laying in a different direction. Well, he noticed that under the skull of this one that was laying in a different position was a rock or a stone. And he took it out and brushed it off, and it had writing on it. I don't know whether you can really tell that on that or not, but he thought, well, this is curious. So he took it, put back everything, and took it to the Smithsonian. And they looked at it and said, well, that's probably some old Cherokee writing. Well, he said, okay. But they got a fellow who was very educated in old languages. He looks at this stone. It was called the Bat Creek stone, incidentally. He said, you're looking at it wrong. He turned it up a different direction. He said, that inscription is ancient Hebrew. They said, what? He said, yeah, the inscription is Judah. So here tonight, you can think about this. Incidentally, Smithsonian immediately hid the stone. They said they was not going to open that can of worms. But where did the American Indian come from? Was there a land bridge somewhere? Did the lost tribe of Judah somehow or the other migrate to North America? After all, it's been 3,000 years. Is it possible? Smithsonian wouldn't touch it. And I guess that's where I'll quit my yakking. Oh.